Hi everyone, my name is Peter Lugger. I've been working as a faculty member and a faculty developer for the last 35 years around universities in Australia and Asia. And I'd like to share today some ideas about what I think are the preconditions or background conditions necessary at universities in order to integrate technologies such as AVR. I'm going to present these as some of the challenges I think universities are facing at the moment, and some of them are quite big challenges. For the last 10 years, I've been working at the Nanyang Technological University, or NTU, in Singapore, and some of the examples that I'm going to give you will come from my experience of working there. So some of the key challenges for the digital university are these. First, the conceptualization of the university space, both physical and digital. I think the whole idea of what a university is in terms of a physical place has changed significantly over the last 30 or 40 years. Secondly, I want to talk about creating a holistic and less compartmentalized learning environment for students. This also includes conceptualization of the space. An important issue that I don't think we talk enough about is how academic subject expertise has changed as a consequence of digital knowledge dissemination, as well as the new conceptions of pedagogy. How we want to teach now actually does make some difference to the notion of subject expertise and how it's used. And lastly, I'd like to think about leadership and rewards for innovation in teaching. Integrating AVR into the teaching at universities as part of everyday life is not going to happen unless we can give rewards to people for changing the way that they teach already. I think it's very useful to think about the university space from the learner's perspective. How do learners now use those spaces, and how do they use the spaces outside the universities in terms of their learning as well? My feeling is that the university is still a unique space. There are certain kinds of things that happen there that don't happen in other places, but it's no longer a sequestered or exclusive space in terms of knowledge dissemination. It's no longer the walled monastic kind of space where knowledge exists within those walls. In fact, you can probably think of the university now as a node in a global knowledge network. That is, there are nodes everywhere and students inhabit a number of those different nodes. The university is one of those nodes rather than the exclusive space it used to be. And I think also it's an intersecting or overlaid network of the physical and the virtual. That is, there's a kind of obviously a virtual network of nodes of knowledge and learning, and there's also the physical network of nodes. The university is one of those. Very important to universities, I think, now in terms of changing conceptions of teaching and the way students learn is changing the built environment for different models of student learning. The question that we might like to ask here is, how does space design actually influence behaviour? How does space design say something about or influence what happens in the classroom? If you look at this classroom, for example, you can ask how space design influences behaviour in this classroom. You might like to think about that just for a moment. What happens when people walk into this classroom? Where do they go to? Where do they sit? What kinds of power relationships are set up by that? What kinds of things are enabled or not enabled by the way that the classroom is set up? And I think that this embodies an outdated model of learning and teaching. When the teacher walks into this room, he or she is inevitably going to go and stand at the front facing the students, with all of the students facing the teacher. And that leads to a particular form of teaching. It's much more likely to lead to didactic teaching than collaborative learning, for example. And it also sets up a certain kind of power relationship between the teacher and the student, with the teacher being seen more as an authority in this kind of situation. At the same time, it's very difficult in a situation like this for the students actually to collaborate. The room simply doesn't allow it. This is a very good example of where a classroom design inhibits certain kinds of behaviours. What we need instead of the old classroom is a classroom where there's more flexibility of movement, a classroom that allows the free movement of people within the room, collaboration amongst students in groups. It allows the teacher to be able to move around the room and discuss things with all of the groups, and that stops the setting up of that kind of hierarchy of the teacher as authority up the front and the students all facing the teacher. It's a much more democratic, if you like, kind of room. But at the back of my mind here is also the question of what it would mean, what it's going to mean in the future, to develop the kinds of spaces that will accommodate AVR so that it works successfully within the university spaces that are available. A key to the future development of learning spaces in universities has got to be the opportunity for multiple forms of interactivity, both face-to-face and within the classroom virtually. So that here is a very good example of the classroom that has permeable boundaries. It's no longer the enclosed space of the classroom that those old rooms represent. This one allows students to interact with each other within the classroom and to interact outside the classroom through digital means. In a building called the Hive at NTU, which is a building with 56 classrooms in it, collaborative spaces like those that you've been seeing in the previous slides. We've developed one space that's been dedicated to AVR. Now you can see that this is the picture on the left, the two pictures on the left, the top and bottom, and you can also see from the two bottom pictures, the one on the left and the one on the right, that the AVR classroom mimics the collaborative classroom that we have built. The question here, of course, is what does this mean? Is this the right kind of classroom? Are these the conditions under which we should be building these, or does it need to go further and to develop spaces for AVR? One thing you can say is that the old classroom, and again here I'm going back to the question of how space determines the kind of behaviour that can happen in it. If you go back to the old classroom, you can see just how completely unsuitable the traditional classroom is for that kind of activity. And what I'm proposing here, of course, is that this old kind of classroom will probably disappear. It has outlived its usefulness. It probably belonged to a particular historical period. And what we're looking at now is much more something like the room on the left-hand side at the bottom. What I'm trying to suggest here is that we begin to turn our minds to what's going to happen in the future if we're going to be creating dedicated spaces that are designed for the integration of AVR. What will they look like? What kinds of conditions will we need? And one of the things that I would suggest is that there needs to be a sense of flow rather than compartmentalization. The old classrooms tended to be walled off from the world around them. They were hermetically sealed in many ways. The new buildings that we've been building at NTU are designed to have a flow between the informal and the formal learning spaces, and I'd suggest that that kind of thinking is what's going to influence how we design classes in the future, or spaces at least in the future, for AVR. What I've been talking about so far is mostly the physical environment and its effect on student learning. It seems to me that this is a really important part of the overall student learning environment. It's the background against which everything else happens. It has to be there in order for everything else to work. And part of the point of it is to ensure that there is a flow for students, that there's a sense of the overall experience, that we don't forget about the informal learning spaces. We look at all of the places where students learn and see how they fit together. And obviously that has implications for AVR. But what we also need to be able to do is to articulate the vision of student outcomes that the university wants. Any institution needs to be very clear about what kinds of things it wants for its students, what it wants its students to be able to do. And therefore all the learning activities that students undertake, the way the spaces are used and designed, the use of technology and so on, should all fit together to achieve those outcomes. In other words, They should be integrated. And what that means is asking important questions from the outcomes, so that instead of saying, for example, oh, here's virtual reality, let's use it, how can we add it on to what we're already doing? Instead, you take some question about the vision the university has. How can virtual reality, for example, promote teamwork in medicine? That's a good question. At NTU, all undergraduates are meant to learn how to work in teams. This is not just about the product of teamwork, but it's also about the process of teamwork. So students need to learn how to work in teams. So the question then would be, is there a role for virtual reality in terms of creating team collaboration in the way that students learn how to work in teams? And that's putting the question backwards, perhaps. Instead of saying that we've got this technology, let's use it, what you say is we've got these ambitions and these ideas that we want to achieve in student learning outcomes. How can the virtual reality or augmented reality actually help to achieve those kinds of outcomes? It's an important way of framing the questions in terms of the pedagogical outcomes that we want. A really important question that I think universities are facing, and one that is almost never talked about, it's a bit of an elephant in the room as far as I'm concerned, is the nature of academic expertise and how it's used, academic expertise and how it leads to professional identity, and what I think that educational technology is doing to that academic expertise and identity. To become an academic, you need to spend a long time training, if you like. If you want to use that word, you do a PhD, you probably do a postdoc, you take at least 6 years to get a proper position. It takes a long time to become an academic. And once people do become academics, they quite rightly value themselves as experts. However, that expertise is seen by a number of academics to be eroded a bit by information technology. There are so many things now that you can find out in other ways. You don't need to, for example, you don't need as an academic to teach Ohm's law. It's a waste of time because students can find out about Ohm's law from a number of other places. What you do need to be able to do as an academic, however, is to help students understand how Ohm's law works. That's where your expertise kicks in. Unfortunately, we have a tradition in academia where people will stand up and recite in lectures and so on about Ohm's law, and they will say students have to learn all of these kinds of things. If we talk about collaborative learning, we're often talking about a kind of learning that for some faculty feels as if their expertise is no longer needed. That's absolutely not true. But it does make a difference to the way that courses are designed and run. So much content expertise is now distributed and available in all kinds of other places. And at the same time, designing courses now requires teamwork. This is another aspect of what some may see as the erosion of academic expertise. It used to be the case that most academics would design courses on their own, they'd run the courses on their own, they'd assess the courses on their own, and so on. And of course, that still happens in many places. But what's beginning to happen now, and certainly happens at NTU, is that courses are designed by a team which includes learning designers, people who are experts in pedagogy, and people who are technologists and so on, and people who create videos. All of these people are now required to build a course because courses are blended learning. They're different, and you cannot expect the academic to be the person who creates all of those kinds of things. So the whole notion of creating a course has actually changed. And I think we need to pay attention to what that means for the way that academics feel about their own professional identity. In the past, and still very much in the present in lots of cases, although it's changing, the model of teaching is one where the expert teacher stands up and delivers his or her expertise, declaims their expertise. And this is still very much a prevailing model. In doing this, of course, what they are doing is reinforcing their identity as experts every time that they do it. And that's one of the things that makes the digital age a challenge to this traditional notion of teaching. The idea of distributed knowledge, which is very much a function of the internet in particular, and which has pervaded our thinking over the last 20 years at least, has made a big difference to this notion of expertise, because you can now find a lot of stuff online. You can now also, as a student, actually challenge teachers sometimes in terms of the kind of expertise that they have. And this has really made a very big difference. I think universities need to pay a lot of attention to this. As David Weinberger suggests, expertise is moving from being a property of individual experts to becoming a property of the net. And while that does not actually change the intensive notion of expertise that faculty have, nor will it diminish the need for that expertise, it does actually mean that that expertise needs to be used differently. Another challenge for universities, I think, is how the people in the universities work together. That is, people who may once have been in separate parts of the university are now required to work together in order to create courses. Blended learning, as the quotation here says, requires the blending of three areas of expertise: pedagogical, technological, design expertise, and subject expertise. Unfortunately, institutions still often treat these independently. This is still the case, even now, after 20 or so years of people focusing on blended learning. Yet, in a number of cases, people are beginning to see that teamwork is necessary in order to create these kinds of courses. And I think if we're thinking again about AVR, this is an important aspect. How do people who develop the technology and people who are responsible for pedagogy and people who design the content of a course and so on, how do we work together? Working together here is the key. Not working in separate areas, not criticizing each other for being different, but actually working together. One of my colleagues at NTU, commenting on this very point, talked about a course that he developed with the Centre for IT Services and with the Teaching, Learning and Pedagogy division that I came from. And he says, redesigning my signal processing course was a team effort, not just by me and colleagues in his School of Computer Science Engineering, but with the Centre for IT Services and the Teaching and Learning and Pedagogy division. This is an important aspect, I think, of where universities are going. Another significant challenge for universities is how to reward and recognise good teachers who are willing to innovate. This has been a problem for a long time in universities where research, particularly in research-intensive universities, where research is the main game. And much as universities would like to say that that's not true, we all know that when it comes to promotion and tenure, research is generally what's rewarded more than teaching. And what that means is that faculty are often unwilling to innovate in teaching. They will very often say things like, the students are not going to reward me for it, I'll go down in my student evaluations and all of these kinds of things. So universities really do need to institute a structure of reward for innovative teaching that is very positive, that moves forward, that looks at the way that new technologies can really genuinely be integrated into their teaching. Going back to one of my earlier points, if we're really going to integrate AVR into everyday teaching and learning practice, then I think one of the things that we need to do is something I mentioned earlier, and that is look at how people work in teams across different areas of expertise. That means faculty, pedagogical experts, learning designers, and those who work professionally in AVR need to work together. And I would make an even further suggestion and say that employers probably need to be involved as well in order to design the kinds of products that will enable students to transfer their learning from one situation to another. But what that requires is that people understand each other. It requires that faculty, pedagogical experts, learning designers, and so on all work together with a single goal in mind, and that is the improvement of student learning in the contemporary world. Secondly, I think that the place of AVR within the overall built environment at least needs to be looked at. How does it work within the university? Not just as an add-on. At the moment, I think there are a lot of forms of technology that tend just to be stuck on to what we've already got instead of being integrated. My vision is that partnerships with architectural companies or specialists in campus design, specialists in interior design can help to contextualize the AVR experience appropriately and to influence how AVR is integrated. Already in the last 35 years or so since I became an academic myself, there's been a much greater integration of different parts of the university in order to design learning spaces. 35 years ago, nobody even consulted academics or students about how to design classrooms. It just wasn't a consideration. People thought a classroom was a classroom was a classroom, and that was it. So somebody came along, made a design, somebody approved it, and that was it. Now, there is extensive consultation, including students. So at NTU, with both our new learning hubs, we consulted with students, as well as the architects, as well as the facilities management, as well as with academics and pedagogical experts and so on, in how to design the rooms. This is a major shift in the conception of learning spaces, and I think that that should pull AVR in as well, so that AVR is not just about AVR, but it's also about the spaces in which they're used. I've already mentioned this, of course, but I feel I need to keep coming back to it because it's one of those really important things that people are not always looking at, and that is how teaching is rewarded. Being innovative, incorporating new technologies, and looking ahead needs to be rewarded. Faculty need to be encouraged to do it. They need to be given recognition for doing it. There needs to be more flexible conceptions of teaching and learning at universities. There needs to be a different way of looking at workload, for example. It can no longer be equated to how many lectures you give. And we need to ensure that there's a vision of what's expected from the use of educational technology that faculty can share in. This is often not the case. Sometimes universities just impose the desire for increased educational technology without really consulting faculty, and I think that needs to change. At the same time, of course, following along with what Eon Reality is actually doing, the capacity for faculty to develop and author their own AVR solutions should be given really serious consideration. So I think this is something, again, that universities have as a challenge to help their faculty to build the capacity to be able to develop and author their own AVR solutions. How this is done includes a number of aspects I've already mentioned, but it has to include some kind of parallel training in thinking pedagogically about the use of AVR solutions. In other words, it won't just happen without a lot of discussion and possibly some training. So finally, I think that if we're going to have a truly integrated and holistic student learning environment, one that is looking ahead to the future and one that integrates technologies like AVR and others, then genuine teamwork is the way to go, with mutual respect for people who have different areas of expertise, all of whom are contributing to the overall student learning environment, rather than the kind of split environment that we've had in the past, where one person does one thing and they don't know what's happening over the other side of the campus, because that has been the way at universities. There needs to be a much better understanding, I think, of collaboration and cooperation. Thanks very much for listening.